Sarah's hands trembled as she watched the excavator's steel teeth tear into her backyard paradise. 20 years of memories, birthday parties, summer barbecues, her daughter's first swimming lessons, crushed into rubble and chlorinated mud. But as Karen's voice echoed behind her, claiming the pool belonged to the community, Sarah realized this wasn't just about property lines. This was war. And Karen had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Part 1. The battle lines. The morning sun cast long shadows across Sarah Mitchell's backyard as she stood on her deck, coffee mug trembling in her hands. The kidney-shaped pool that had been the centerpiece of her property for 2 decades lay drained and empty, its Mediterranean blue tiles now exposed like scales on a dying fish. Today was demolition day. "You sure about this, Mom?" Sarah turned to find her 22-year-old daughter Emma standing in the doorway, still in her pajamas despite it being nearly 9 a.m. Emma's auburn hair, so much like Sarah's had been before the grey started claiming territory, caught the morning light. "The maintenance costs are killing me, Em. $2,200 last month alone." Sarah's voice carried the weight of too many sleepless nights spent staring at bank statements. "And with you graduated and your father's alimony payments ending next year." She didn't need to finish. Emma understood. The divorce had been finalized 3 years ago, but the financial aftershocks continued to ripple through their lives. David had moved to Arizona with his 28-year-old yoga instructor, leaving Sarah with the house, the mortgage, and all the memories that came with both. The rumble of heavy machinery announced the arrival of Torres Demolition. Sarah watched as a massive excavator rolled off the flatbed trailer, its yellow paint gleaming like a predator's warning coloration. Behind it came a smaller truck carrying 2 workers in hard hats and safety vests. Mrs. Mitchell. A stocky man with graying temples approached the deck. "Miguel Torres. We spoke on the phone." Sarah nodded, forcing herself to smile. Miguel's crew had been recommended by 3 different contractors, and his bid had been the most reasonable. Still, watching strangers prepare to destroy something she'd once loved felt like witnessing her own surgery. "The permits are all in order," Miguel continued, pulling a folder from his truck. "City inspector signed off yesterday. We'll have this wrapped up by Thursday, weather permitting." "Thursday," Sarah repeated, the word tasting strange. By Thursday, the pool where Emma had learned to swim, where countless neighborhood children had celebrated birthdays, where Sarah herself had floated on summer evenings after particularly brutal days at the insurance office, would be nothing but filled earth and fresh sod. "Excuse me. Excuse me." The voice cut through the morning air like fingernails on a chalkboard. Sarah's stomach clenched as she recognized the shrill tone before she even turned around. Karen Henley stood at the property line, her platinum blonde hair shellacked into its usual helmet-like perfection, wearing a pink tracksuit that had never seen actual exercise. Karen had moved into the neighborhood 8 years ago with her husband Robert, a pharmaceutical sales manager who traveled 3 weeks out of every month. She'd immediately appointed herself the unofficial neighborhood watchdog, complete with a laminated binder of HOA regulations that she quoted like scripture. "What exactly is going on here?" Karen's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. She marched across Sarah's yard without invitation, her designer sneakers leaving prints in the dew-damp grass. "I'm having my pool removed," Sarah said, keeping her voice level despite the irritation already building in her chest. "Good morning to you too, Karen." "Removed?" Karen's eyes widened with the kind of theatrical shock reserved for community theater productions. "But Sarah, that pool is a community resource. Half the neighborhood has used it over the years. You can't just destroy it." Miguel Torres glanced between the 2 women, his expression shifting from professional courtesy to wary confusion. His crew had stopped unloading equipment and were watching the exchange with the kind of fascination usually reserved for car accidents. "It's my property, Karen." Sarah descended the deck steps, closing the distance between them. "My pool, my maintenance costs, my decision." "But what about property values?" Karen's voice rose another octave. "A pool adds significant value to the entire street. This is incredibly selfish, Sarah. Incredibly short-sighted." Emma appeared at Sarah's shoulder, her presence both comforting and concerning. Sarah didn't want her daughter drawn into this confrontation, but she also appreciated the backup. "Mrs. Henley," Emma said, her voice carrying the kind of barely restrained politeness that only someone in their 20s could manage, "maybe this isn't really your business." Karen's head swiveled toward Emma like a surveillance camera locking onto a target. "Young lady, everything that affects property values in this neighborhood is my business. I'm the treasurer of the Willowbrook Community Association, and I take that responsibility seriously. The HOA has no authority over individual homeowner decisions regarding pools," Sarah said. "I checked." "There are other considerations beyond mere legality," Karen shot back. "Community spirit, neighborly consideration, the greater good." Miguel Torres cleared his throat. "Ladies, I hate to interrupt, but we are on a schedule here. Mrs. Mitchell, should we proceed?" Sarah looked at Karen's flushed face, then at Miguel's patient expression, then at Emma's clenched jaw. 8 years of Karen's passive-aggressive comments at block parties. 8 years of unsolicited advice about lawn care and holiday decorations. 8 years of feeling judged and found wanting by someone who'd never worked a day in her life. "Yes," Sarah said firmly. "Proceed." The excavator's engine roared to life with a diesel growl that sent vibrations through the ground. Karen took a step back, her face cycling through expressions of shock, outrage, and something that might have been panic. "This is a mistake, Sarah," she called over the noise. "A big mistake. There will be consequences for this." "Are you threatening me?" Sarah's voice carried a dangerous edge that made Miguel's crew exchange glances. "I'm warning you," Karen said, backing toward the property line. "Some things can't be undone. Some decisions have ramifications you can't even imagine." With that ominous proclamation, she stalked back toward her own house, her pink tracksuit a bright spot of indignation against the morning landscape. "Mom." Emma's voice was uncertain. "What do you think she meant by that?" Sarah watched Karen disappear into her house, then turned back to Miguel. "How long until you can get started?" "Give us 20 minutes to set up properly," he replied. "But if there's going to be neighborhood drama, maybe we should." "There won't be any drama," Sarah interrupted. "Just do the job." But even as she said it, she felt a cold certainty settling in her stomach. Karen Henley never made empty threats. Whatever she was planning, it wouldn't be pleasant. The first bite of the excavator's bucket into the concrete sent a crack like gunfire across the quiet morning. Sarah watched 20 years of memories disappear into rubble and dust, while somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered that Karen was right about one thing: some decisions really couldn't be undone. By noon, the excavator had chewed through half the pool's concrete shell. Sarah had retreated to her kitchen, unable to watch the destruction but unable to leave the house either. The noise was tremendous, grinding, crushing, the occasional sharp crack of breaking concrete that made her flinch every time. Emma had left for her job at the bookstore, but not before giving her mother a long hug and promising to bring Chinese takeout for dinner. "Don't let that woman get to you," she'd said. "You're doing what you need to do." Sarah was trying to grade insurance claims at her kitchen table when the doorbell rang. Through the front window, she could see a silver Audi in her driveway, Karen's car. Sarah's first instinct was to ignore it, but the ringing became insistent, followed by sharp knocking. "Sarah, I know you're in there." Karen's voice carried clearly through the solid oak door. "We need to talk." Against her better judgment, Sarah opened the door. Karen stood on the porch holding a manila envelope and wearing an expression of grim satisfaction that made Sarah's skin crawl. "I tried to warn you," Karen said without preamble. "I tried to give you a chance to reconsider." "What are you talking about?" Karen held up the envelope. "City Building Department. Turns out your demolition permit has some irregularities." Sarah's blood chilled. "That's impossible. Miguel handled all the paperwork." "Did he handle the heritage survey?" Karen's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Did he check with the Historical Preservation Committee?" "This house was built in 1987. There's nothing historical about it." "The pool, Sarah. The pool was built in 1985 by Romano Construction. Vincent Romano used a unique aggregate mixture. That's now considered historically significant to the development of residential pool construction in this region." Sarah stared at her neighbor, trying to process what she was hearing. "That's insane." "Insane or not, it's city policy. Any structure built by Romano Construction between 1980 and 1990 requires heritage review before demolition." Karen's voice dripped with false sympathy. "I'm afraid your demolition is now illegal." As if summoned by her words, the grinding noise from the backyard suddenly stopped. Sarah heard voices. Miguel. The city inspector's name was Bradley Hoffman, and he delivered bad news with the enthusiasm of someone reading grocery lists. Sarah sat across from him at her kitchen table while Miguel Torres paced behind them, his work boots leaving muddy prints on her hardwood floor. The stop work order is immediate and non-negotiable, Hoffman droned, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. Romano construction pools require a full heritage assessment before any demolition can proceed. The process typically takes 6 to 8 weeks. 6 to 8 weeks. Sarah's voice cracked. What am I supposed to do with a half-demolished pool? For 2 months. That's not really the city's concern. You should have checked the heritage registry before beginning work. Miguel stopped pacing and turned to face them. Look, I've been doing demolition in this city for 15 years. Nobody ever mentioned any Romano construction registry to me. Hoffman shrugged. The registry was established in 2019. It's the contractor's responsibility to stay current with city regulations. Sarah watched her contractor's face darken. $2,500 of her savings were tied up in his equipment and crew time. Now they were all stuck in bureaucratic limbo because of Karen's vindictive phone call. How much will the heritage assessment cost? She asked, though she was afraid of the answer. Base fee is $800, plus additional costs if they determine the pool has historical significance. Hoffman gathered his papers with practiced efficiency. If it's deemed historically significant, you'll need to apply for special demolition permits, which could run another $2,000 to $3,000. The numbers hit Sarah like physical blows. After the divorce, every dollar was accounted for, budgeted down to the penny. She didn't have $3,000 for permit sheet. Never needed before Karen's interference. And if I can't afford the assessment, she asked quietly, then the pool stays as is. Hoffman stood, smoothing his tie. Half demolished or not, no further work can be done without proper permits. After he left, Sarah and Miguel stood in awkward silence, staring out at the destruction in her backyard. The excavator sat motionless beside the gouged concrete crater, like a sleeping dinosaur guarding its kill. Mrs. Mitchell, Miguel said finally, I feel terrible about this. My crew did everything by the book, but apparently the book changed. And nobody told us. It's not your fault. Sarah's voice was hollow. This is Karen's doing. The neighbor lady. Why would she? Because she's a controlling psychopath who can't stand other people making decisions without her permission. The words came out more bitter than Sarah intended. She's been trying to run this neighborhood like her personal kingdom since the day she moved in. Miguel nodded slowly. I've seen this before. HOA types who treat their neighbors like property. Management issues. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Look, I know this puts you in a tough spot financially. I can keep the stop work order quiet for a few days while you figure things out. Insurance companies don't need to know immediately. Sarah looked at him sharply. Miguel had 3 kids and a mortgage of his own. The last thing she wanted was to get him in trouble with the city. No, she said. Don't risk your business because of my problems. Then what are you going to do? Sarah stared at the destroyed pool, her mind racing through possibilities. She could try to get a personal loan, but her credit was still recovering from a divorce. She could ask Emma for help, but her daughter was barely scraping by on bookstore wages. She could call David, but the thought of begging her ex-husband for money made her stomach turn. Or she could fight back. Miguel, she said slowly, how well do you know city regulations? Pretty well. Why? Well enough to help me file a complaint. That afternoon, Sarah sat in the basement office of City Hall, surrounded by filing cabinets and the smell of old paper. Across from her, Patricia Vance from Code Enforcement reviewed the complaint form with professional interest. You're alleging harassment by a neighbor? Patricia asked. She was a woman in her 50s with graying hair and the kind of patient demeanor that suggested she'd seen every possible variety of neighborhood dispute. Karen Henley has been systematically interfering with my property rights, Sarah said, keeping her voice steady. She admitted to calling in the anonymous tip about my pool demolition, and she's made several threatening statements about consequences for my decisions. Patricia made notes on the form. Do you have any documentation of these threats? Witnesses. My daughter Emma heard her say there would be consequences. Miguel Torres heard her claim my pool was community property. Community property. Patricia's eyebrows rose. That's an interesting claim. Does Mrs. Henley have any legal stake in your property? None whatsoever. She moved to the neighborhood 8 years ago and immediately started acting like she owned the entire street. Patricia tapped her pen against the desk. I'll need to investigate this, of course. But if what you're saying is true, Mrs. Henley may have violated several municipal codes regarding neighbor harassment and abuse of city services. Sarah felt a small spark of hope. What kind of violations? Filing false reports, harassment, interference with permitted work. If I can substantiate your complaint, she could face fines and a formal restraining order. The spark grew brighter. How long does the investigation take? Usually 2 to 3 weeks. But Mrs. Mitchell, I have to ask, is this really about harassment, or are you angry about the stop work order? Sarah met Patricia's eyes directly. 3 years ago, Karen Henley called the city to complain about my daughter's car being parked on the street during her graduation party. Last year, she reported my fence height without measuring it. It was within code by 2 inches. 6 months ago, she filed a noise complaint about my air conditioning unit, which the inspector found to be well within acceptable limits. Sarah's voice grew steadier with each example. This isn't about the pool. This is about 8 years of a woman who thinks she has the right to control how other people live. Patricia nodded slowly. I see. Well, I'll look into it. In the meantime, try to document any further interactions with Mrs. Henley. Dates, times, witnesses if possible. Sarah left City Hall feeling lighter than she had all day. It wasn't much, but it was action. It was fighting back instead of just enduring. She was so focused on her small victory that she almost missed the silver Audi parked across from her driveway when she got home. Karen was sitting behind the wheel, talking animatedly on her phone. When she saw Sarah, she ended the call and rolled down her window. Sarah. Karen's voice carried its usual false cheer. I heard there was some confusion about your demolition permits today. No confusion, Sarah replied, not breaking stride. Toward her front door. Just your interference. I wouldn't call it interference. I'd call it community oversight. Karen got out of her car, following Sarah up the driveway. But I think there might be a way to resolve this whole situation. Despite herself, Sarah stopped. What are you talking about? Karen's smile was all teeth and no warmth. Well, since you're clearly having financial difficulties, and I completely understand, divorce is so hard, maybe we could work out an arrangement. What kind of arrangement? You keep the pool. I organize a neighborhood maintenance fund. Everyone who's enjoyed your backyard over the years contributes a little something. You get help with the costs, and the community keeps a valuable resource. Sarah stared at her neighbor, trying to process the audacity of the suggestion. You want me to keep a pool I can't afford so other people can use it. Think of it as community partnership. Karen's enthusiasm seemed genuine, which somehow made it worse. Your backyard becomes a shared neighborhood amenity. Very progressive, very modern. Some of the most forward-thinking communities are doing this kind of resource sharing. And who would be in charge of this neighborhood fund? Karen's pause was infinitesimal, but Sarah caught it. Well, as HOA treasurer, I suppose I'd be the natural choice to handle the financial arrangements. The audacity was breathtaking. Karen had sabotaged the demolition, forced Sarah into an impossible financial situation, and was now proposing to take control of her backyard under the guise of helping. Get off my property, Sarah said quietly. Sarah, please. I'm trying to find a solution that works for everyone. You're trying to steal my backyard. Sarah's voice rose. You tanked my demolition so you could swoop in and take control of my pool under some insane community sharing scheme. That's not. I would never. Karen's composure cracked slightly. I'm trying to help you. By forcing me to keep a pool I can't afford so you can play queen of the neighborhood. Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. You're unbelievable. Karen's mask finally slipped completely. Fine. If you want to be stubborn, that's your choice. But don't come crying to me when you're facing city fines for an abandoned demolition. Cite. Don't come begging when the HOA starts looking into property maintenance violations. And don't expect any sympathy when your property values tank because of that eyesore in your backyard. Are you threatening me again? I'm stating facts. Karen was back in her car now, voice carrying through the open window. You made your choice, Sarah. Now live with the consequences. As Karen drove away, Sarah realized she was shaking, not with fear, but with rage. The woman had orchestrated this entire crisis just opposite. The recording device was smaller than Sarah had expected, a tiny black rectangle that clipped to her bra strap like a miniature phone charger. Patricia Vance had delivered it personally at 7 a.m., along with a crash course in evidence collection. The key is to let her talk, Patricia had explained, adjusting the device's position. Don't lead the conversation, don't put words in her mouth. If she's really trying to extort you, she'll reveal herself. Now, 24 hours later, Sarah stood at her kitchen window watching Karen's daily routine with the focus of a wildlife photographer. Karen emerged from her house at exactly 8:15 a.m. for her morning power walk, returned at 9:45 for coffee on her deck, then spent 30 minutes watering plants that clearly didn't need it while surveying the neighborhood like a general. Reviewing troops. Emma had left early for a double shift at the bookstore, but not before expressing serious doubts about her mother's plan. Mom, what if she gets suspicious? What if she finds the wire? It's not a wire, Em. It's digital, and it's invisible. Under clothing. That's not what I'm worried about. Emma had sat at the kitchen table, her coffee growing cold as she studied her mother's face. I'm worried about you. This woman has already proven she's vindictive and manipulative. What happens when she finds out you're building a case against her? Sarah had kissed her daughter's forehead, tasting the familiar sweetness of youth and worry. Then I'd better make sure the case is airtight before she finds out. At 10:30 a.m., right on schedule, Sarah saw Karen emerge from her house carrying a manila envelope. Instead of heading for her car, she walked directly towards Sarah's front door. Sarah's heart hammered as she activated the recording device and went to answer the knock. Sarah. Karen's smile was brilliant and utterly fake. I hope you've had time to think about our conversation yesterday. Come in, Sarah said, stepping aside. Would you like coffee? Karen's surprise was genuine. Oh, well, yes, that would be lovely. They settled at the kitchen table, the same spot where Sarah had received the devastating news about the heritage assessment. Karen placed her envelope on the table and folded her hands with the satisfied air of someone about to deliver good news. I've been doing some research, Karen began, and I think I've found a solution to your problem. My problem? The pool situation, of course. Karen opened the envelope and withdrew several official-looking documents. I have a friend at the Heritage Commission. We were in the same book club, and she explained the process to me in detail. Sarah sipped her coffee, letting the silence stretch. Karen's need to fill conversational gaps was legendary in the neighborhood. The thing is, Karen continued, the heritage assessment isn't just about Romano construction techniques. It's about community impact. If enough neighbors testify that the pool has significant community value, they might designate it as a neighborhood historical landmark. And what would that mean? Karen's eyes gleamed. It would mean you couldn't demolish it. Ever. But here's the beautiful part. The city would be required to help with maintenance costs through their historical preservation fund. Sarah set down her coffee cup carefully. Help how? Up to 60% of annual maintenance costs, plus a one-time restoration grant to repair any damage. Karen's voice grew more animated. Sarah, this could solve all your financial problems. The city would basically pay you to keep the pool. In exchange for what? Well, since it would be a community landmark, there would need to be some level of public access. Nothing crazy, maybe organized swim times during summer months, properly supervised of course. Who would supervise these swim times? Karen's pause was almost imperceptible. The Historical Preservation Committee would need to appoint a community liaison, someone to coordinate schedules, collect fees for maintenance costs, ensure proper insurance coverage. Someone like you. Well, Karen laughed, a tinkling sound like breaking glass. I do have experience with community organization. And since I initiated the heritage review process, I'm already familiar with the requirements. Sarah leaned back in her chair, studying her neighbor's face. The woman was incredible. She'd created a bureaucratic crisis, then engineered an elaborate solution that would give her exactly what she'd wanted from the beginning: control of Sarah's pool. What if I don't want public access to my backyard? Karen's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Sarah, be realistic. You can't afford the heritage assessment, and you certainly can't afford the special demolition permits if the pool is designated historically significant. This way, you keep your home's value, get help with costs, and contribute to the community. And if I refuse? Well, Karen's voice took on a regretful tone. Then you're looking at significant city fines for an abandoned demolition site. The daily penalties alone could run into thousands of dollars. Plus, there's the matter of property maintenance violations, standing. Water in that crater is going to become a mosquito breeding ground, which is a health code violation. And once the HOA gets involved. She let the threat hang in the air like smoke. The HOA. Robert has been asking questions about the property damage visible from the street. Apparently, several neighbors have expressed concerns about how this situation affects property values. Karen's voice carried false sympathy. I've been defending you, of course, but there's only so much I can do if the community feels you're being irresponsible. Sarah felt the recording device against her ribs like a small, warm heart. Karen was being even more explicit than she'd hoped. So my choices are bankruptcy or giving you control of my backyard. I wouldn't put it that way. Karen's laugh was nervous now. Think of it as partnership. Community collaboration. You provide the space, I handle the logistics. Everyone wins. What kind of fees would you collect? Just enough to cover insurance and basic maintenance. Maybe $50 per family for the summer season. With 15 families in the immediate neighborhood. That's $750. Sarah's voice was flat. You want to collect $750 from my neighbors to use my pool. To help maintain your pool, Karen corrected quickly. The fees would go directly to upkeep costs. I wouldn't take anything for myself. This is community service. Except you'd be in charge of everything. The schedule, the fees, the rules. Someone has to coordinate. Someone has to control, you mean. Karen's mask slipped slightly, revealing something sharp and ugly underneath. Sarah, I'm trying to help you. If you can't see that, if you're going to be paranoid and ungrateful, then maybe you deserve the financial consequences of your poor decisions. My poor decisions. Buying a house you couldn't afford after the divorce. Keeping a pool you couldn't maintain. Making major demolition decisions without proper research. Karen's voice grew harder with each word. Some people need guidance. Sarah. Some people need someone else to make the smart choices for them. Sarah stared at her neighbor, understanding flooding through her like ice water. This wasn't just about the pool. This was about Karen's fundamental belief that other people were too stupid to manage their own lives. And you're volunteering to make those choices for me. I'm volunteering to clean up the mess you've made, Karen snapped. But if you'd rather go bankrupt defending some ridiculous principle about property rights, that's your business. She started gathering her papers, her movements sharp with irritation. The heritage assessment hearing is next Tuesday. I'll be there to testify about the pool's community significance. So will Robert, and the Johnsons, and probably half the street. We're going to tell them exactly how important that pool has been to this neighborhood. Whether I want you to or not. Karen stood, clutching her envelope. What you want stopped mattering the moment you decided to destroy community property without consulting the people who've been using it for years. It's not community property. It's my property. Not anymore. Karen's smile was cold and sharp. Not once the Heritage Commission hears our testimony. Not once they understand how selfish and destructive your actions have been. She walked toward the front door, then turned back. You have until Tuesday to change your mind. After that, the decision will be out of your hands permanently. After Karen left, Sarah sat in her kitchen for a long time, staring at the empty coffee cups and processing what had just happened. Karen hadn't just threatened her, she'd revealed her entire strategy. The heritage hearing wasn't about historical preservation. It was about manufactured community testimony designed to strip Sarah of her property rights. Sarah pulled out her phone and called Patricia Vance. I got it all, she said when Patricia answered. Everything. The extortion, the manufactured community support, even her admission that she's coordinating neighborhood testimony. That's excellent, Mrs. Mitchell. But I have to warn you, Karen Henley has been busy too. She's filed a formal complaint with the HOA claiming you're creating a public nuisance. She's also contacted several city departments about alleged property maintenance violations. Sarah's stomach dropped. What kind of violations? Standing water, debris accumulation, potential structural hazards from the partial demolition. She's requesting immediate city inspection of your property. Can she do that? Anyone can request inspections. Whether they find violations is another matter. But Mrs. Mitchell, I think you show. Judge Rebecca Martinez had the tired eyes of someone who'd spent 20 years listening to neighbor disputes, and her expression suggested she'd heard every possible variation of property line drama. Sarah sat in the plaintiff's chair, hands folded to hide their trembling, while Patricia Vance organized documents at the prosecutor's table. Karen sat across the aisle with her attorney, a sharp-suited man named Richard Caldwell who specialized in HOA law and property disputes. She wore a navy blue dress that screamed respectability and had somehow managed to make her eyes look perpetually on the verge of tears. This is a preliminary hearing for a temporary restraining order, Judge Martinez announced. Ms. Vance, present your case. Patricia stood, holding the small recording device. Your Honor, Mrs. Mitchell has been the victim of systematic harassment by her neighbor, Karen Henley. Over the past week, Mrs. Henley has weaponized city bureaucracy to interfere with permitted work on Mrs. Mitchell's property, then attempted to extort control of that property by creating an artificial crisis. She played excerpts from the recording, Karen's threats about city fines, her admission about organizing community testimony, her claim that Sarah needed guidance in making decisions about her own property. Karen's attorney objected twice, calling the recording taken out of context and a conversation between concerned neighbors, but Judge Martinez listened with the focused attention of someone hearing something genuinely disturbing. When the recording ended, Caldwell stood for Karen's defense. Your Honor, my client is a respected member of the community who serves as HOA treasurer and has legitimate concerns about property values and community safety. Mrs. Mitchell's abandoned demolition has created actual hazards: standing water, exposed concrete, structural instability. Mrs. Henley was attempting to find a collaborative solution to a real problem by threatening bankruptcy and city fines. Judge Martinez asked, by explaining the legal reality of Mrs. Mitchell's situation. Sometimes the truth sounds like a threat when people don't want to hear it. Sarah watched Karen during her attorney's presentation. The woman sat perfectly still, hands folded, expressing just the right amount of concerned sadness. She looked like someone's worried aunt, not a manipulative neighbor who'd orchestrated an elaborate scheme to steal a backyard. Mrs. Mitchell, Judge Martinez said, do you have anything to add? Sarah stood, her heart hammering. Your Honor, Karen Henley has spent 8 years trying to control how I live in my own home. She's filed false complaints about my daughter's car, my fence height, my air conditioning, and now my pool demolition. Every time I make a decision she doesn't like, she finds a way to punish me through city bureaucracy. And you believe this latest incident is part of that pattern? I believe she sabotaged my demolition specifically so she could position herself as the solution. She created a crisis and then demanded control in exchange for fixing it. That's not neighborly concern, that's extortion. Judge Martinez reviewed her notes for what felt like an eternity. Finally, she looked up. The recording is troubling, and I'm inclined to believe Mrs. Mitchell's account of systematic harassment. However, the specific threats captured on recording are indirect rather than explicit. Mrs. Henley was describing potential consequences rather than promising to personally inflict them. Sarah's heart sank. Therefore, I'm going to issue a limited restraining order. Mrs. Henley is prohibited from entering Mrs. Mitchell's property without permission and from filing any further complaints with city departments unless she has evidence of actual violations that pose immediate public safety risks. This order will remain in effect for 30 days while the parties work to resolve their differences. Caldwell looked satisfied. Patricia looked frustrated. Karen looked like she'd just won the lottery. However, Judge Martinez continued, and something in her tone made everyone sit straighter. I'm also going to recommend that the city attorney's office review the circumstances surrounding the pool demolition permits. If there's evidence that city processes were abused for personal gain, that's a matter for criminal investigation. Karen's face went pale. Outside the courthouse, Patricia walked Sarah to her car while Karen and her attorney huddled in urgent conversation near the courthouse steps. "It's not the victory we wanted," Patricia said, "but it's something. The criminal investigation recommendation could lead to real consequences for Karen if they find evidence of abusive process." "How long will that take?" "Months, probably. But Sarah, the limited restraining order helps. She can't file any more bogus complaints, and she can't set foot on your property." Sarah unlocked her car, exhaustion hitting her like a physical weight. "What about the heritage hearing? Can she still testify against me?" "That's not a city complaint, so yes. But the judge's comments about abusive process might make the Heritage Commission take a harder look at her motivations." As Sarah drove home, she called Emma at the bookstore to update her on the hearing results. Her daughter's relief was audible when she heard about the restraining order, even the limited version. "At least she can't come to the house anymore," Emma said. "Maybe now you can focus on solving the actual pool problem instead of fighting Karen." But when Sarah pulled into her driveway, she realized the war was far from over. Her front yard was filled with cars. The Johnsons from next door, the Patels from across the street, the elderly Kowalskis from the corner house, and at least 6 other neighbors she recognized from block parties and Christmas card exchanges. They were gathered on her lawn like some sort of impromptu town hall meeting. Robert Henley stood at the center of the group, holding a clipboard and addressing the crowd like a union organizer. Karen was nowhere to be seen, probably prevented by the restraining order from being on Sarah's property, but her husband was clearly acting as her proxy. Sarah sat in her car, watching through the windshield as Robert gestured toward her half-demolished pool, and her neighbors nodded along with whatever he was saying. Mrs. Kowalski was dabbing her eyes with a tissue. Mr. Patel looked genuinely angry. Finally, Sarah got out of the car and walked toward the group. Conversation stopped as she approached, creating an uncomfortable silence that felt like walking into a funeral. "Sarah." Robert's voice carried forced cheer. "We were hoping to catch you. We wanted to discuss Tuesday's heritage hearing." "On my front lawn." "Well, we thought it would be good to see the property situation firsthand," Robert continued smoothly. "Several neighbors have concerns about how the destruction is affecting the community." Sarah looked around the circle of faces, people she'd known for years, whose children had played in her pool, who'd attended Emma's graduation party just 3 months ago. Now they looked at her like she'd poisoned their water supply. "What concerns?" she asked. Mrs. Johnson stepped forward, her voice shaking with emotion. "Sarah, that pool has been part of this neighborhood for 20 years. My children learned to swim in your backyard. My grandchildren too. It's not just your property, it's a community treasure." "A treasure that I pay to maintain," Sarah replied. "A treasure that costs me $3,000 a year in chemicals, cleaning, and repairs." "But we've all benefited from it," Mr. Patel added. "Property values, neighborhood appeal, the sense of community it created. Doesn't that count for something?" Sarah stared at him. "Are you offering to help pay for it?" The silence stretched uncomfortably. "The heritage designation would provide funding," Robert said quickly. Karen explained the whole program. The city would help with maintenance costs, and community access would be properly organized and supervised. Supervised by Karen. "By whoever the Heritage Commission appoints," Robert corrected, though his tone suggested they both knew who that would be. Sarah looked around the circle again, understanding finally settling over her like a cold blanket. These people weren't here because they cared about historical preservation or community resources. They were here because Karen had convinced them that Sarah was taking something away from them, something they'd never owned but had come to feel entitled to. "So you're all planning to testify against me on Tuesday?" "We are planning to testify for community preservation," Mrs. Kowalski said, her voice wobbly but determined. "For the children who still need a safe place to learn to swim. For the neighborhood traditions that make this place special. Against my wishes. Against my property rights. Against my financial ability to maintain something I never agreed to share." The uncomfortable silence returned. "Sarah," Robert said finally, "no one wants to be adversarial here. But sometimes individual desires have to be balanced against community needs. Sometimes the greater good requires personal sacrifice." Sarah felt something snap inside her chest, not breaking, but shifting into a new configuration entirely. "Get off my property," she said quietly. Sarah, please, all of you, get off my property right now. We are trying to find a solution. The solution is for all of you to mind your own business. Sarah's voice rose. The solution is for you to respect property rights and personal autonomy instead of acting like a mob because one woman convinced you that you're entitled to something that was never yours. She pulled out her phone. I'm calling the police. You have 30 seconds to leave before I report you for trespassing. The Heritage Commission meeting room was standing room only by 6 p.m. Tuesday evening. Sarah sat in the front row, a manila envelope thick with documents resting on her lap. Behind her, she could feel the weight of neighborhood eyes, the Johnsons, the Patels, the Kowalskis, and at least a dozen others who'd come to testify about the historical significance of her pool. Karen sat across the aisle with Robert, both dressed like they were attending a funeral. Karen's navy suit was pristine, her makeup flawless, her expression radiating the kind of sorrowful determination usually reserved for war memorials. She looked like a woman bravely defending community values against selfish individualism. She had no idea what was coming. Commissioner Elena Vasquez called the meeting to order and read the case summary. We are here to determine whether the Romano construction pool at 1247 Willowbrook Drive meets criteria for historical preservation designation under Municipal Code 14.7. Before we begin testimony, Sarah stood, her voice carrying clearly across the packed room. I'd like to submit additional evidence for the Commission's consideration. She approached the Commissioner's table and handed copies of her envelope to each member. Commissioner Vasquez opened hers immediately, her eyebrows rising as she scanned the contents. Mrs. Mitchell, what exactly are we looking at? Historical records. Commissioner, documentation showing that this entire heritage review is based on fraudulent information. The room erupted. Karen shot to her feet, her face flushing red. Objection. This is highly irregular. This is a public hearing, Mrs. Henley, not a courtroom, Commissioner Vasquez replied coolly. Mrs. Mitchell has the right to present evidence. Please continue. Sarah turned to face the audience, her heart hammering but her voice steady. For the past week, you've all been told that my pool was built by Romano Construction using historically significant techniques. That's a lie. She pulled out the first document. This is the original building permit from 1985. The pool was built by Aquatic Designs Incorporated, not Romano Construction. Vincent Romano had nothing to do with my backyard. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Sarah saw Mr. Patel lean forward, confusion replacing certainty on his face. Furthermore, Sarah continued, pulling out more papers, I contacted the Heritage Commission's research department. There is no Romano Construction historical registry. There never was. The entire heritage preservation program Karen described to me doesn't exist. Commissioner Martinez, a middle-aged man with silver hair, was reading through the documents with growing interest. Mrs. Mitchell, are you alleging that false information was provided to initiate this review? I'm alleging fraud. Sarah's voice grew stronger. Someone called the city claiming my pool met heritage criteria that don't exist, creating a bureaucratic crisis based on completely fabricated information. She turned to look directly at Karen, whose face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. The question is, who would have access to enough city contacts to make false heritage claims sound official? Who would know exactly which departments to call to create maximum confusion? Who would benefit from manufacturing a crisis that only they could solve? This is ridiculous. Karen stood again, her voice shrill. Sarah is grasping at straws because she knows the community opposes her selfish. Sit down, Mrs. Henley. Commissioner Vasquez's tone was sharp. Mrs. Mitchell, do you have evidence supporting these allegations? Sarah smiled for the first time in weeks. I have a recording of Mrs. Henley admitting she orchestrated the heritage review to gain control of my property. I also have documentation of her pattern of filing false complaints with city departments over the past 8 years. She handed over Patricia Vance's investigation file, complete with records of every bogus complaint Karen had filed, the car parking violation that wasn't a violation, the fence height that was within code, the air conditioning noise complaint. That found no violation. Additionally, Sarah continued, I have financial records showing that Mrs. Henley has been systematically targeting neighbors who make property improvements without her approval. The Hendersons received a surprise property tax reassessment the week after they installed their new deck. The Garcias got a zoning violation notice the day after they painted their house. Every family who's made changes Karen disapproved of has faced some kind of bureaucratic retaliation. The room was dead silent now. Sarah could see neighbors looking at each other with dawning realization. Mrs. Johnson's face had gone white. Mr. Patel was staring at Karen with something approaching horror. "This isn't about historical preservation," Sarah said, her voice ringing with conviction. "This is about one woman's systematic campaign to control every aspect of neighborhood life through abuse of city services. She's turned bureaucracy into a weapon, and she's used all of you as ammunition." Commissioner Vasquez was reading through the complaint records, her expression growing darker with each page. "Mrs. Henley, these are serious allegations. Do you have any response?" Karen was standing frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Finally, Robert stood beside her, his hand on her arm. "This is obviously a vindictive attack by someone who's bitter about legitimate community concerns, Mr. Henley," Commissioner Martinez interrupted. "Did you know that filing false reports with city departments is a Class B misdemeanor punishable by up to 6 months in jail and $5,000 in fines?" The color drained from Robert's face. Sarah wasn't finished. She pulled out her final document, a notarized statement from Patricia Vance detailing Karen's extortion attempt, complete with transcript excerpts from their recorded conversation. Mrs. Henley created this entire crisis so she could position herself as the solution. "She sabotaged my demolition permits, then offered to help by taking control of my property through a community management scheme. When I refused, she threatened me with bankruptcy, city fines, and HOA violations. That's not community service, that's extortion." Commissioner Vasquez set down the documents and looked directly at Karen. "Mrs. Henley, in light of these allegations, I'm suspending this heritage review pending investigation by the city attorney's office. If evidence supports Mrs. Mitchell's claims, you could face criminal charges for filing false reports and abuse of municipal services." "This is insane." Karen finally found her voice. "I've dedicated years to this community. I've volunteered countless hours. I've tried to maintain property values and neighborhood standards. And this is how I'm repaid. By being destroyed by a woman who's too selfish to share a swimming pool." The words hung in the air like smoke. Even Robert looked embarrassed by his wife's outburst. Commissioner Martinez leaned forward. "Mrs. Henley, are you admitting that you initiated this heritage review to force Mrs. Mitchell to share her pool?" Karen realized her mistake too late. Her mouth snapped shut, but the damage was done. Sarah stood and faced the audience one final time. "For 8 years, I've tried to be a good neighbor. I've hosted block parties, let your children swim in my pool, contributed to community events. But I've also been systematically harassed, threatened, and manipulated by someone who believes her vision of community gives her the right to control other people's property." She looked directly at Mrs. Johnson. "Your children were always welcome in my backyard. That was my choice, my gift to the neighborhood. But it was never your right. It was never something you were entitled to." She turned to Mr. Patel. "Property values aren't maintained by forcing people to keep amenities they can't afford. They're maintained by respecting each other's rights to make decisions about their own homes." Finally, she looked at the Kowalskis. "Community isn't built by bullying people into compliance. It's built by supporting each other's autonomy and choices, even when we disagree with them." The silence in the room was profound. "Commissioner." Vasquez stood. "The heritage review is officially suspended. Mrs. Mitchell, you're free to complete your pool demolition once you obtain proper permits through normal channels. Mrs. Henley, you'll be hearing from the city attorney's office." As the crowd filed out, Sarah noticed how many neighbors avoided eye contact with Karen, how quickly the support that had seemed so solid just an hour ago evaporated into embarrassment and regret. Mrs. Johnson stopped beside Sarah's chair. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "We got caught up in Karen's campaign without thinking about what we were really supporting." Mr. Patel nodded from behind her. "I feel like an idiot. She made it sound like you were destroying something that belonged to all of us." "You weren't idiots," Sarah replied. "You were manipulated by someone who's very good at manipulation. The important thing is that you recognize it now." Karen was the last to leave, walking past Sarah with her head high and her jaw set in defiant anger. At the door, she turned back. "This isn't over," Sarah, you may have won tonight, but you've lost your community. No one will ever trust you again. No one will ever help you when you need it. Sarah looked at her former neighbor, this woman who'd spent 8 years trying to control everyone around her, who'd weaponized city bureaucracy for personal gain, who'd turned community spirit into a tool for extortion. Karen, she said quietly, I don't need to control my neighbors to feel secure. I don't need to tear other people down to build myself up. I don't need to steal other people's PR.